Good day, everyone. Welcome to PHS Talks, a series of virtual presentations on historical subjects produced by the Peterborough Historical Society. Today we welcome as our speaker retired Captain David Rumball of the Canadian Army. Since retiring, Captain Rumball worked 18 years for the Peterborough Regional Health Centre. While in Peterborough, he has engaged in extensive volunteer work, including the Canadian Red Cross, St. John's Ambulance, and an affordable housing charity. For this and many other contributions, he has been recognized with numerous awards and medals. In this episode of PHS Talks, posted on November 11th, David Rumball reflects upon the significance of Remembrance Day. Welcome, David Rumball.
Well, thank you, Dale, and hello, everyone. I must admit that when Dale approached me to talk about Remembrance Day, I was hesitant. After all, it has been over 35 years since I last had to prepare a paper for his consideration. I can only hope my mark now will be higher. But Remembrance Day is a subject in which everyone has an understanding, sometimes due to a connection of a family member or friend who saw service in the military. I gained my appreciation of Remembrance Day through my youth in a small town where services each November the 11th meant the town shut down and everyone gathered at the local cenotaph. Back then, it was a federal holiday, and in my humble opinion, it should be still one, but I digress. I am not going to enter into the history of Remembrance Day in Canada, as I trust that everyone here knows that it commemorates the end of hostilities in 1918 between the Allied forces and Germany. It does not mark the end of the war, however, as that did not happen formally until the Treaty of Versailles was signed in Paris in 1919. My hometown of Coburg was an old artillery garrison town with a small C conservative history, and until 1973 had an army depot there. The presence of people in uniform was an everyday sight as I grew up, and so I attained an appreciation of Canada's military past through talking with many school friends, parents, and grandparents who had served. When I was old enough, I joined the local Air Cadet Squadron, which led to the path I later chose when I joined the Army Reserves. My main reason for enlisting was to pay for my university, which it did. But I also feel that service to my country takes many forms, and the military was one that I had seen since my earliest days. As a youth attending Remembrance Day parades in Coburg, I saw large numbers of veterans on parade with their families looking on from the sidelines. Over the years, the number of veterans dwindled as nature took its course. And just as unfortunate, the number of spectators also declined, but for different reasons. By the mid-1980s, at the Peterborough War Memorial, I would be on parade each November the 11th, and noted that the number of veterans and serving members equaled, if not surpassed, the number of spectators. I realized that the date was no longer a holiday, and therefore not everyone could attend, and the passage of time had prevented a higher turnout of veterans. Society had also turned away from commemorating the sacrifices of those who had gone to war and become a culture of abhorrence of war and all its attendant parts. I recall walking through the university in my Army uniform one Remembrance Day and being asked where I was going and why. But Remembrance Day was never about glorifying war. It is about remembering what war brings so that it will not be repeated. After 1918, and until about 1943, the 1914-18 war was referred to as the Great War. It was only after the United States joined the war in 1941 against Japan and Germany and their allies that the name Great War was replaced with the First World War. The conflict current at that time became the Second World War. As an aside, I would like to point out that the correct way in Canada, and indeed in the British Commonwealth, of referring to these two conflicts is as the First World War and the Second World War. Calling them World Wars I and II are Americanisms, which have invaded our language, so I prefer to call them by their correct description. The idea of a place of honor for a tomb of the unknown warrior first started in England in 1916 and gained favor quickly. On the 11th November 1920, a soldier who had died in France in the Great War was removed from his grave with great ceremony and dignity and transferred to London, where he was interred in Westminster Abbey in front of King George V and many other dignitaries. The King's daughter-in-law, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, laid her bouquet on the tombstone after her wedding in the Abbey to the King's second son, Prince Albert, whom we know better as King George VI, and she as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. She did this in memory of her older brother, Fergus, who was lost in action in France in 1915. Her daughter, then Princess but now Queen Elizabeth II, followed this example, and the tradition has continued with every bride married in Westminster Abbey. To this day, this is the only tombstone in the Abbey upon which it is forbidden to walk. As part of Canada's Y2K Millennium Partnership Program, the Royal Canadian Legion took the initiative to petition the federal government to create a tomb of the unknown soldier to be placed at the National War Memorial in Ottawa. The government agreed, and on the 28th of May 2000, the tomb was unveiled. Inside rests an unidentified Canadian soldier who was killed in action in France near Vimy Ridge. Since the unveiling, a uniquely Canadian tradition happens each Remembrance Day when hundreds of attendees at the service leave their poppies there on the tomb. And on Canada Day, hundreds lay little Canadian flags there. An unknown soldier, but not forgotten. There is an old adage that those who forget their history are doomed to repeat it. This was coming true in the 1980s and 90s, as the Warsaw Pact fell apart, as governments reduced their military budgets, and the public as a whole placed Remembrance Day on the back burner. Ceremonies still occurred in major cities, more for the political side than for the veterans. Then came 9/11, and attitudes changed overnight. As Canada geared for war for the first time in nearly 60 years, and our young men and women deployed overseas, an awareness of our military past was suddenly resurrected. The idea of wearing red shirts on Fridays to support our troops was one of the many campaigns conducted by people here in Canada to show our armed forces that they were foremost in our minds. And once our troops began to return home, the impact of war became personal. The Highway of Heroes segment on Highway 401 between Trenton and Toronto would see our country come to a halt each time a motorcade traveled along that route. And although our losses in the Afghanistan campaign were far less than in either World War or in Korea, those motorcades are etched into our collective memory with the footage shown on mass media, which was not available in the first half of the last century. For myself, I knew 2 of the soldiers who received these motorcades, and many others who returned home before their tour of duty was done due to injuries sustained in action. I have also had the honor of meeting some veterans of the First World War and of several veterans of the Second World War. As an elementary student, we had an assembly in our school each Remembrance Week, and a local veteran spoke to us. He was Captain Charles Rutherford from the nearby town of Colburn, and a winner in the First World War of the Victoria Cross, the highest award for action in the face of the enemy. Later, I came to be acquainted with Lieutenant Colonel the Reverend John Foote, who won a Victoria Cross as a captain for his work at Dieppe, France in 1942, where he stayed behind with the wounded soldiers as our troops retreated in the face of superior forces. Padre Foote was a prisoner of war for almost 3 years. I cannot imagine being held in such a camp and undergoing the ordeals he and others experienced. I have also spoken with many who shared their experience of service with me that they would not or could not tell other family members. Some kept their private horrors to themselves and carried on as best they could, while others sought escape through outside methods. Most suffered from various degrees of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. One Peterborough man, of whom I have particularly fond memories, told stories for years of the many humorous experiences he had during 4 years of service in the Second World War, and of how those experiences got him through the tough times. This same man was wounded on 3 separate occasions and saw most of his company of over 100 men killed or wounded around him in his final battle. Again, I cannot imagine what the late Jim Newell went through. But it is because of men and women like that and of what they did that allows us the ability to try and imagine. One veteran I knew spoke at the dedication of the Peterborough Armory as an official National Historic Site. His voice has been stilled by the passage of time, but his words still ring out now as they did over 20 years ago, and I shall try to paraphrase them here. He pointed out that the Armory stands to allow a rallying point for our soldiers to ensure our freedoms. To the north of the Armory is the former PCVS, a functioning secondary school at that time, and a building that offers continuing instruction. There is the freedom of education that we enjoy today. To the south of the Armory is the Murray Street Baptist Church. There is the freedom of religion that we enjoy today. Across the park in front of the Armory is City Hall, where our leaders meet to determine our municipality's concerns. There is the freedom of a democratically elected government that we enjoy today. The man who spoke those words was Brigadier General Max Clark, a Peterborough man and veteran of the Second World War. In the middle of 2019, a group of like-minded people got together to establish a Peterborough Military Museum with a display room in the Peterborough Armory granted to us by the commanding officer of the local regiment. I have the honor to be the secretary of that committee, and our mandate is to collect, preserve, and display items of local historical military interest. We received a grant of funds to start things rolling, and we're making great headway until COVID-19 caused us, like many other organizations, to put our plans on hold. We continue to gather artifacts, nevertheless, having recently assumed the collection of the now closed Peterborough Naval Association. We will be showcasing the city and county's military history from First Nation era to the present, and hope to have rotating displays throughout the year once things are allowed to reopen. During the First World War, Canada's population stood at just over 8 million people. Almost 1/10 of them enlisted in the British or Canadian Armed Forces, meaning over 600,000 people. If we were to take 10 people here today and have them stand up to represent the nearly 10% of our population who served in the First World War, we would find one was killed in action and might not have a known grave. 3 were wounded physically so severely that they were unable to return to their pre-war lifestyle and employment. 2 suffered from what we now call PTSD and were institutionalized for the rest of their natural lives. This only left 40% of those who joined able to return to the lives they left. And who knows what scars they carried with them internally. And so we honor all those people and those after them who have served, and especially those who did not return. It is for them and for our future generations that we should not break the faith of Remembrance Day. We show that faith by wearing a poppy, which has now become a universal symbol of remembrance. It started with John McCrae's 1915 poem In Flanders Fields and grew into an international reminder of the horrors of war. Today there are movements to wear different colors of poppy other than the traditional red. White poppies denote peace, and in Australia a few years ago, they started wearing blue poppies to honor animals who died on active service. This is all well and good, but it is the traditional red poppy which honors all those who served and did not return, not just people. In the words of the British poet Lawrence Binyon, written in 1914 after the first casualty lists appeared in England, we will remember them. Thank you.